I found out my husband was dead from a police chaplain standing in my hospital room before anyone in my family even looked me in the eye. Less than 3 hours later, I gave birth to our daughter 6 weeks early. While I lay there, unable to feel my legs after an emergency delivery, my parents were not asking if I was alive, whether the baby was breathing, or if I needed anything. They were arguing in the hallway about life insurance forms, federal survivor benefits, and how quickly paperwork could be filed before other people got involved. I didn't understand those words then. I wish I had. My name is Megan Carter. I'm 31 years old, and until that week I believed that no matter how difficult life became, your own parents would stand beside you when everything else fell apart. I learned instead that tragedy doesn't change people. It only reveals who they already are. Lucas and I had been married for just over 4 years. He was a police officer outside Nashville, the kind who still believed the badge meant serving people instead of chasing promotions. He never talked much about work when he came home. He preferred grilling in the backyard, fixing things around the house that didn't actually need fixing, and talking to our unborn daughter while his hand rested on my stomach. Every evening he would kneel beside the nursery crib he had assembled himself and say, "Your dad is going to embarrass you at every school event, so you might as well get used to it." I always laughed. Looking back now, those ordinary evenings became the richest memories I have. The morning everything changed started like any other. Lucas kissed my forehead before leaving for an early shift. He noticed I looked tired and insisted I call my doctor if the contractions I'd been having became stronger. Before closing the front door, he smiled and said, "Don't let your father convince you to move our retirement savings again. He still thinks every conversation is a financial seminar." I rolled my eyes because Dad had been a financial consultant for almost 30 years and never missed an opportunity to tell everyone how they should manage money. Lucas never argued with him directly, but I knew he didn't trust him. A few months earlier, he had quietly suggested that we keep every account requiring 2 signatures and never leave blank forms anywhere in the house. I thought he was simply being cautious. Now I know he had already noticed things I refused to see. Around noon, I started feeling real contractions. They were closer together than before. I called Lucas, but the call went straight to voicemail. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. I expected his voice. Instead, an unfamiliar man introduced himself as Chaplain Robert Ellis from the police department. His tone changed everything before he even finished the sentence. He asked whether someone was with me. I remember dropping the phone onto the kitchen floor. The next several hours blurred together into flashing lights, ambulance sirens, doctors shouting instructions, and someone explaining that the stress had triggered premature labor. I barely processed the words armed robbery or line of duty. My mind refused to accept them. When I woke after surgery, the room was dim. My daughter was in the neonatal unit because she had arrived too early. Lucas was gone forever. I had become both a mother and a widow before sunset. The first people I expected to comfort me were my parents. Instead, when they finally arrived, my mother hugged me for less than a second before asking where Lucas kept his insurance documents. I stared at her, convinced medication had made me hear incorrectly. "Honey," she said, smoothing her jacket as though we were discussing groceries, "these things have deadlines. We have to think practically." My father nodded in agreement while pulling a leather folder from his briefcase. He asked whether Lucas had updated beneficiaries after the pregnancy. I whispered that I didn't know. He immediately started making notes. Neither of them asked how I was feeling. Neither asked about their granddaughter. My younger brother Caleb didn't come at all. My mother explained he was under a lot of pressure and didn't handle hospitals well. I accepted that answer because I had accepted excuses for Caleb my entire life. Growing up, every mistake he made somehow became someone else's responsibility. If he failed a class, the teacher was unfair. If he lost money, the market was unpredictable. If he argued with friends, they were jealous. My parents always found a reason he wasn't accountable. Lucas noticed it long before I did. During one family barbecue, after Caleb borrowed money from 3 relatives in one afternoon, Lucas quietly told me in the car, Your brother doesn't have a money problem. He has a consequences problem. I laughed then because it sounded harsh. Now I realize Lucas wasn't judging him. He was warning me. That first night in the hospital, I couldn't sleep. Every monitor beep reminded me that my daughter was fighting to breathe while the man who should have been holding her had been buried beneath paperwork before his body had even returned home. Around 2 in the morning, a nurse named Rebecca adjusted my IV and gently asked if anyone from my family had stayed with me. I looked toward the empty chair beside the bed and shook my head. She hesitated before saying, "I only ask because I saw your parents downstairs earlier. They were in the administration office asking about documentation for government survivor benefits." My heart sank in a way that had nothing to do with grief. Something about that sentence didn't feel right. Rebecca quickly apologized, saying she probably shouldn't have mentioned it. I thanked her anyway. After she left, I stared at the ceiling for nearly an hour. My parents had spent more time downstairs handling paperwork than upstairs with me. The next morning, I finally held my daughter for the first time. She was impossibly small, wrapped in tubes and blankets, but when her tiny fingers closed around mine, the noise in my head disappeared for a few precious seconds. I whispered Lucas's name and promised her she would know everything about her father. I also promised something else without fully understanding why. I promised that no one would ever use her life as a transaction. Less than an hour later, my father walked into my room carrying another folder thick with documents. His expression wasn't warm. It was focused, almost impatient. "Megan," he said, placing the papers across the hospital table, "we need to move quickly before these agencies create unnecessary delays." I looked down at the stack of forms, then back at him. Before I could ask a single question, I noticed several pages already carried what looked disturbingly like my signature, and in that moment, something inside me finally began to wake up. I kept staring at the signature until my father casually slid the papers closer, as if my silence simply meant I needed a better angle to read them. My hands were still weak after surgery. The IV tugged every time I moved my arm. "You probably don't remember signing some preliminary authorization," he said with a practiced smile. "The hospital has had you on medication. We just need to finish everything properly." I looked at the date beside the signature. It was the day before. I hadn't held a pen. I hadn't even been able to sit up without help. "I never signed this," I said quietly. My mother immediately sighed, almost annoyed that I had slowed the conversation. "Megan, sweetheart, don't make this harder than it already is. Your father knows what he's doing." That sentence had followed me my entire life. Whenever my father handled taxes, investments, mortgages, or insurance, everyone accepted his word without question. He built a career advising families on financial planning. People trusted him because he always sounded calm and prepared. I had trusted him too, until that moment. He tapped one page with his finger. "These are federal survivor benefits for families of officers killed in the line of duty. There are insurance proceeds, state compensation, pension transfers, and several emergency payments. Delays can create problems." I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about Lucas, about our daughter sleeping behind glass in the neonatal unit, about the empty side of my bed that would stay empty forever. My father was thinking about account numbers. "I'll read everything later," I answered. His expression tightened for only a second before he recovered. "There isn't time for later." My mother crossed her arms. "Lucas would have wanted you to be practical." Hearing her use my husband's name that way made something inside me recoil. Lucas had always insisted on reading every document before signing it. He once spent an entire Saturday comparing mortgage clauses because one sentence didn't feel right. He would never have rushed me. "Not today," I repeated. My father slowly gathered the papers, but I noticed he left one page face up by accident. Across the top, I could clearly read "Authorization for Representative Access." His own name appeared beneath the heading. He wasn't just helping me file claims, he was asking for authority to act on my behalf. When they finally left, I asked the nurse to lock every document in the cabinet beside my bed. Rebecca looked at my face for a long moment before quietly saying, "Would you like us to note in your chart that no paperwork should be presented without hospital legal staff present?" I hadn't even realized that was possible. "Yes," I answered immediately. She nodded once without asking another question. That small act of respect felt more comforting than anything my parents had done. Later that afternoon, I visited my daughter again. The neonatal nurse smiled as she carefully placed the tiny bundle into my arms. "She's stronger today," she whispered. I traced my finger across my daughter's tiny hand and wondered how I was supposed to protect someone when I suddenly felt unsure about the people who had raised me. While I sat there, my phone vibrated repeatedly. Group messages from relatives filled the screen. Everyone offered condolences. Everyone praised Lucas as a hero. Mixed among them were messages from my father asking whether I had reconsidered signing the forms. One arrived only 7 minutes after the previous one. Then another asking me to call him immediately because deadlines were approaching. He had sent me more messages about paperwork than about my own health. That evening, I finally called Lucas's mother, Evelyn. We had spoken only briefly since his death because she was arranging funeral plans with the department. The moment she heard my voice, neither of us could speak for several seconds. Then she quietly asked, "How's my granddaughter?" Not the insurance, not the funeral expenses, not the benefits. My granddaughter. I started crying so hard that I couldn't answer. Evelyn simply stayed on the phone until I could breathe again. After I told her about the baby, she said she would drive to the hospital first thing in the morning. Before hanging up, she added something that stayed with me. "Lucas always worried that you carried too much by yourself. Let us help now." It struck me that she said us, even though she had just lost her only son. The next morning, she arrived carrying homemade soup, clean clothes for me, and a tiny knitted blanket she had finished only days earlier. She sat beside my bed for nearly 2 hours. We talked about Lucas. We laughed through tears over the terrible songs he used to sing while washing dishes. She showed me childhood photographs I had never seen. Not once did she mention money. As she prepared to leave for the neonatal unit, she hesitated. "Megan." Daniel Brooks called me. Captain Daniel Brooks had been Lucas's closest friend on the force for almost 12 years. I knew him well enough to trust him completely. Evelyn continued, "He wants to stop by when you're feeling strong enough. He said Lucas left something with him a few months ago. He thought it probably wasn't important at the time." A strange feeling settled over me. "What was it?" She shook her head. "He wouldn't say over the phone." Before I could think further, my parents returned. The warmth in the room disappeared almost instantly. My mother glanced at Evelyn with polite distance before turning to me. "We need a private conversation." Evelyn calmly stood. "Actually, I was just leaving." She squeezed my shoulder and quietly whispered, "Call me if you need anything. Anything at all." The door had barely closed before my father placed another folder on the table. This one was thicker than the first. "Megan, we've already started filing several preliminary claims." My heart skipped. "Started?" he answered without hesitation. "Someone had to. You weren't capable." I slowly opened the folder. Several application forms had already been submitted electronically. My name appeared on each one. Digital signatures, timestamps, official confirmation numbers. I looked at the submission dates. They had all been filed while I was unconscious after giving birth. My father watched my face carefully. "It's perfectly routine," he said. "I simply helped move the process along." But one detail immediately caught my attention. The contact email listed for every federal payment wasn't mine. It belonged to my father's private consulting firm. At that exact moment, my phone rang. The screen showed a familiar name, Captain Daniel Brooks. I answered, and the first words out of his mouth made every hair on my arms stand up. "Megan," he said in a controlled voice, Whatever you do, don't sign another single document until you see what Lucas asked me to give you." I asked my father to step out while I took the call. He didn't move. He simply folded his arms and said, "Anything Daniel has to say can be said in front of family." For the first time in my life, I looked directly at him without lowering my eyes. "You are the reason I need privacy." The room became completely silent. Even my mother looked surprised. After a long second, my father picked up his folder and walked into the hallway. My mother followed him, muttering that I was exhausted and not thinking clearly. The moment the door closed, I answered. "Daniel." His voice was calm, but I could hear tension underneath it. "Are you alone?" "For now." "Good. Lucas asked me to hold on to an envelope in case anything ever happened to him. We both hoped I'd never need to deliver it." My throat tightened. "What is it?" "Documents, a flash drive, and a voice recording. He told me to give it only to you." I couldn't speak. Daniel continued. "I'm coming to the hospital this afternoon. Before I get there, I need you to answer one question honestly. Has anyone asked you to sign financial paperwork?" I closed my eyes. "Yes, my parents. They already filed documents using my name." There was complete silence on the other end before he quietly said, "I was afraid of that." Every word felt heavier than the last. "What do you mean?" "Lucas never trusted your father's financial advice. He never accused him of anything illegal, but he told me several times that some situations didn't make sense. About 6 months ago, he asked me something unusual." "What?" "He asked where someone should report suspected fraud involving federal survivor benefits if anything ever happened to him." My pulse started racing. Lucas had never mentioned that conversation. Daniel continued carefully. "I asked him why he was thinking about something so specific. He told me he hoped he was being paranoid." I stared toward the hospital window. Everything Lucas had casually said over the last year suddenly returned to me. Keep both signatures on the accounts. Never leave blank forms lying around. Don't let your father reorganize the investments. At the time, I thought he was simply cautious. Now, each memory felt different. "Daniel," I whispered, "what exactly did Lucas suspect?" "He believed your father had asked too many questions about police death benefits. Not about protecting you, about how payments were processed." Before I could answer, someone knocked gently on the door. Rebecca stepped inside. "Captain Brooks is actually here already." I looked at the phone. Daniel laughed softly. "Looks like I made better time than I expected." A minute later, he walked into the room wearing civilian clothes instead of his uniform. He looked exhausted. The circles under his eyes made it obvious he hadn't slept much since Lucas died. Without saying a word, he hugged me carefully, mindful of my injuries. Then he placed a sealed manila envelope on the bedside table. My name was written across the front in Lucas's handwriting. I traced the letters with trembling fingers. Daniel quietly said, "He sealed it himself." My hands shook so badly that Daniel opened the envelope for me. Inside was a small flash drive, several printed documents, and a folded handwritten note. On the top of the note, Lucas had written, "If you're reading this, something happened to me before I could explain everything myself." Tears blurred my vision. Daniel waited while I unfolded the pages. Lucas's handwriting filled every line. He explained that over the previous year my father had repeatedly offered to help organize our finances after the baby arrived. At first, Lucas appreciated the advice. Then he noticed something strange. My father kept asking detailed questions about survivor pensions, life insurance structures for law enforcement officers, and federal compensation available to families killed in the line of duty. Lucas wrote that the conversations made him uncomfortable because they always drifted away from budgeting and toward what would happen if the worst occurred. He admitted he felt guilty for distrusting my father but couldn't ignore the feeling. One paragraph hit me harder than everything else. "Megan, if I'm wrong, you'll probably think I worried over nothing. If I'm right, promise me one thing. Don't let anyone pressure you into signing documents while you're grieving, especially not because they claim it's urgent. Read everything. Trust your instincts. Daniel reached for the flash drive. There's more. Rebecca quietly closed the blinds and left us alone. Daniel plugged the drive into his laptop. Several folders appeared. One contained scanned financial notes Lucas had kept. Another held screenshots of emails. Then Daniel opened an audio file. Lucas's voice filled the room. It sounded so ordinary that for a second I forgot he was gone. If you're hearing this, I probably never got the chance to tell you in person. Meg, I love you, but I need you to listen carefully. I don't think your father is after us because he hates us. I think he's desperate. I found out Caleb owes more money than anyone realizes. Gambling, sports betting. I overheard enough during dinner to know it's serious. Your dad thinks he can fix it. I don't know how far he'd go. Maybe not far at all. Maybe farther than either of us wants to believe. Just don't trust him with anything financial if I'm not here. The recording ended. Neither Daniel nor I spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, I whispered, "Caleb?" Daniel nodded. We looked into it quietly this morning after finding the emails. Nothing official yet, but one detective confirmed Caleb has several civil judgments against him. Significant debt. Everything began connecting. My father's urgency, the forged signatures, the electronic filings, the representative access forms, my brother's mysterious financial problems. Suddenly, the money wasn't simply compensation after Lucas's death. It was a rescue plan for Caleb. Before either of us could continue, raised voices echoed from the hallway. My father was arguing with someone. Seconds later, the hospital door opened without warning. My parents walked in together, followed by Caleb for the first time since Lucas died. He looked exhausted, unshaven, and avoided my eyes completely. My father stopped the moment he noticed Daniel sitting beside my bed. His expression changed instantly. "Captain Brooks," he said carefully. "I didn't realize this was an official visit." Daniel stood slowly. "It wasn't, until now." My father smiled politely, but I saw his jaw tighten. "Then perhaps this is a family matter." Daniel didn't move. Not anymore. Caleb finally looked at me. His face was pale. He opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something, but no words came out. My father interrupted before he could speak. "Megan," he said firmly, "these officers have no reason to interfere with private financial decisions." Daniel calmly reached into his jacket and placed several printed emails beside Lucas's letter. "Actually," he replied, "they do." My father glanced down for only a fraction of a second. That was enough. The color drained from his face, because staring back at him were copies of emails sent from his business account discussing survivor benefit timelines, 2 weeks before Lucas was killed. And one subject line made the entire room fall silent. "Once federal compensation clears, Caleb's debts disappear." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. My father looked at the printed email, then calmly lifted his eyes toward Daniel. If I hadn't known him my entire life, I might have believed the confidence on his face. He gave a small shrug and said, "That proves nothing. I advise clients on financial matters every day. Discussing possible compensation after a tragedy isn't a crime." Daniel didn't argue. He simply slid another sheet across the table. "Read the timestamp." My father didn't touch it. "Go ahead," Daniel repeated. "It was sent less than 4 hours after Officer Carter was pronounced dead." I watched my father's expression carefully. His breathing changed almost imperceptibly. He had expected to control this conversation. Instead, someone else had arrived with documents he hadn't prepared for. My mother stepped forward before he could answer. "This is unbelievable," she snapped. "Our daughter just lost her husband, and you're interrogating grieving parents in a hospital." Daniel remained remarkably calm. "No one is interrogating anyone. I'm asking questions because documents were submitted using Megan's electronic signature while she was recovering from emergency surgery. My mother's eyes shifted toward me. Megan told you that? I nodded. Because it's true. She shook her head as though I were a confused child. You authorized your father months ago to help if anything happened. No, I answered. I didn't. She immediately looked toward Caleb. Tell your sister she's mistaken. Caleb swallowed hard but stayed silent. I'd never seen him look so uncomfortable. He kept staring at the floor instead of defending our parents. Daniel noticed it too. Caleb, he said evenly, did you know your father's consulting email was listed as the primary contact for Megan's survivor claims? Caleb looked up, then immediately back down. I don't know anything about paperwork. My father answered for him. Because he doesn't. Leave him out of this. That single sentence confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Caleb knew enough to be afraid. Daniel carefully gathered the documents back into the folder. I'm not accusing anyone today. I'm advising Megan not to sign or authorize anything until independent legal counsel reviews every submission. My father laughed once. It sounded forced. Independent counsel? For paperwork I completed to help my own daughter? Especially for paperwork completed without her knowledge, Daniel replied. The room fell silent again. Finally, my father picked up his briefcase. We're leaving. My mother hesitated. She looked at me with disappointment rather than concern. I hope someday you understand we were trying to protect you. Then both of them walked out. Caleb remained standing near the door. After several awkward seconds, he quietly said, Meg, I'm sorry. Before I could answer, he followed them into the hallway. Daniel waited until the door closed. He's scared. I nodded. Of my father? Daniel looked toward the hallway. Maybe. Maybe of something else. About 20 minutes later, Rebecca returned carrying a clipboard. Hospital administration asked me to let you know they've placed a temporary hold on any financial authorizations connected to your patient file until identity verification is completed. Relief washed over me for the first time in days. At least nothing else could move without my knowledge. That evening, Evelyn came back with fresh clothes for me and coffee for Daniel. She listened quietly while we explained what had happened. She never interrupted. When Daniel finished, she reached into her purse and placed a small notebook beside Lucas's letter. I almost forgot, she said. Lucas left this at my house after Thanksgiving. Inside were handwritten reminders, grocery lists, maintenance schedules, and random notes. Near the back, one page had been folded separately. Across the top, Lucas had written, "Financial questions to double-check." Underneath were several bullet points. Verify beneficiaries annually. Never allow third-party account access. Confirm all federal claim contacts directly. Then, one final line had been underlined twice. If anyone insists something must be signed immediately, stop and ask why they're rushing. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. Lucas hadn't been suspicious because he disliked my parents. He had been trying to protect me without damaging my relationship with them. He had hoped he was wrong. Daniel quietly closed the notebook. Tomorrow morning, I'm bringing Detective Laura Mitchell from the Financial Crimes Unit. She specializes in document fraud involving government compensation programs. Does that mean there's already an investigation? I asked. Not officially, he answered, but after seeing the electronic filings, she believes there are enough irregularities to start asking questions. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed conversations from the past several years. Dad insisting we move investments into accounts he supervised. Dad offering to prepare our tax filings for free. Dad asking Lucas detailed questions about police pensions during family dinners. I had laughed those conversations away because financial planning was his profession. Now, every memory felt different. The next morning began peacefully. I spent nearly an hour in the neonatal unit holding my daughter. One of the nurses smiled as she watched me. She settles down every time she hears your voice. I whispered stories about Lucas while my daughter slept against my chest. For a little while, the world outside the hospital disappeared. Then Rebecca appeared at the nursery entrance. "Megan, there are detectives downstairs. They're asking if you're comfortable meeting them." I nodded. 20 minutes later, Daniel returned with Detective Laura Mitchell, a woman in her 40s carrying 2 organized binders. She introduced herself gently before explaining why she was there. "Mrs. Carter, we're only gathering information today. No one is under arrest. We simply need to determine whether any federal documents were submitted using unauthorized signatures or false representations." She opened one binder and carefully laid out copies of electronic filing records. These applications originated from the same IP address. She pointed toward the screen capture. "That address belongs to your father's consulting office." My stomach tightened. "You're sure?" "Our preliminary review indicates yes." She turned another page. "More importantly, several files were created before your medical discharge and before your electronic identity verification could legally occur." Daniel quietly added, "Someone appears to have bypassed required authentication." Detective Mitchell nodded, "Which raises serious concerns." Before we could continue, another officer stepped into the room carrying a tablet. "Detective, you should probably see this." She accepted the device. After only a few seconds, her expression changed. "Where did this come from?" "Search warrant returned from the cloud backup connected to Mr. Harrison's consulting office." She turned the screen toward us. A series of recovered messages filled the display. One message from my father to my mother froze the air inside the room. "Once Megan signs the remaining forms, everything transfers cleanly. She'll never notice until Caleb is back on his feet." Detective Mitchell looked directly at me. "Mrs. Carter," she said quietly, "I don't think your parents were planning to ask for your permission at all." The knock that followed interrupted everyone. Rebecca opened the door. Her face had gone pale. "Your parents are back," she whispered, "and they're demanding that security let them into your room immediately." Rebecca barely finished her sentence before raised voices echoed through the hallway. My father's calm, professional tone was gone. He was demanding to see me immediately, insisting that he was my legal representative. Detective Mitchell exchanged a quick look with Daniel before quietly asking the hospital security officer to keep the door closed. Through the glass panel, I could see my mother gesturing dramatically, pointing toward my room as though she were the victim in all of this. Nurses slowed down as they passed, pretending not to watch while clearly hearing every word. The attention made my parents even more determined. My father finally shouted, "They're manipulating my daughter while she's medicated." Detective Mitchell remained completely composed. "Mrs. Carter," she said to me, "you decide who enters this room. No one else." It amazed me that a stranger respected my choices more than my own parents ever had. I took a deep breath. "I don't want them in here." Security nodded, and a few moments later the arguing moved farther down the hallway. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Daniel looked toward me. "You did the right thing." I wasn't sure it felt right. It felt heartbreaking. But I also knew that if I allowed my father back into the room, he would find another way to pressure me into signing something. Detective Mitchell reopened her binder. "We received another response from federal investigators this morning." She slid several printed pages toward me. "Your father's electronic submissions didn't just redirect correspondence to his consulting firm. One amended form attempted to designate an outside financial administrator for temporary benefit management." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "If approved, some survivor payments could have been routed through an account controlled by the appointed administrator before reaching the beneficiary." Daniel answered quietly, "Your father." My hands went cold. Would he actually have been able to take the money? Detective Mitchell shook her head. Not permanently if everything was reviewed correctly, but temporary access could have allowed transfers, loans, or other financial movements before discrepancies were discovered. Suddenly, Lucas's warning made perfect sense. It had never been about one insurance payment. It had been about control. Every dollar meant for me and my daughter could have passed through my father's hands first. While we were talking, my phone buzzed again. Caleb's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated before answering. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Meg, can we talk?" "Where are you?" "Parking garage." He sounded terrified. "Dad doesn't know I stayed." Daniel motioned for me to keep the call on speaker. "What is it, Caleb?" There was a long pause. Finally, he said, "You deserve to know why this happened." I closed my eyes. "Tell me." His breathing became uneven. "I owe a lot more money than anyone told you." "How much?" Another silence. "Almost $400,000. I nearly dropped the phone. "How?" "Sports betting, online gambling, loans. It just kept getting bigger." Tears filled his voice. Dad kept telling me he could fix it. Detective Mitchell quietly began taking notes. Caleb continued. "After Lucas, after everything happened, Dad said there would finally be enough money to make everyone whole." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Did you know he was forging documents?" "No." His answer came instantly. "I swear, Megan. I knew he wanted to manage the money, but I didn't know he'd already started filing paperwork in your name." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" His voice broke. "Because I wanted to believe he was only borrowing it." Borrowing it. Those two words hurt almost more than everything else. My brother hadn't imagined the money helping me recover after losing my husband. He imagined it rescuing himself. Before anyone could respond, Caleb whispered something else. "There's one more thing." "What?" "Dad deleted a lot of emails." Detective Mitchell immediately leaned closer. "How do you know?" "Because I helped him buy the software that erased them." The room went completely still. "But," Caleb continued, "he didn't know the office automatically backed everything up to cloud storage every night. I only realized that yesterday." Detective Mitchell looked at Daniel with unmistakable excitement. "If that's true, we may have the complete communication history." Caleb gave them the account information and quietly ended the call. I sat there staring at my phone. I had spent years believing my brother was simply irresponsible. I never imagined he had been drowning in debt while my father quietly built an entire plan around my husband's death. Later that afternoon, Detective Mitchell left to coordinate with federal investigators. Daniel stayed behind. We talked about Lucas for over an hour. He smiled while remembering academy training, terrible practical jokes, and late-night patrol shifts. Then he reached into his jacket one last time. "I almost forgot." He handed me a small velvet pouch. Inside was Lucas's wedding ring. I hadn't realized it had been removed after the accident. I held it in my palm while tears rolled silently down my face. Daniel spoke softly. He wore it on every shift, even when regulations suggested leaving jewelry at home. I slipped the ring onto a chain Rebecca found for me so I could wear it around my neck. It rested against my heart, warm from my skin. For the first time since Lucas died, I felt as though a small part of him had come home. Early that evening, Evelyn arrived carrying dinner for everyone in the room, including the nurses. She somehow remembered every person's name after meeting them only once. Watching her thank each staff member reminded me again how different kindness looked from manipulation. She sat beside me and gently brushed my daughter's tiny blanket with her fingertips. "Lucas would be so proud of you," she whispered. Before I could answer, Detective Mitchell hurried back into the room. She looked more serious than before. "We recovered the cloud backup." Daniel immediately stood. "What did you find?" She placed a printed email on the table. "Enough to move this from an inquiry to a criminal investigation." I looked down at the page. It wasn't just financial planning anymore. It contained a conversation between my father and an attorney he believed represented a private asset recovery company. My father wrote that if his daughter became emotionally unstable after the funeral, temporary financial authority could be justified for her own protection. He had already planned to portray me as mentally incapable of managing my own affairs. My stomach turned. Then Detective Mitchell placed one final document beside it. "There's something else." Across the bottom of the page was a scheduled appointment. Tomorrow morning. Hospital room 418. Final signatures from beneficiary. My parents hadn't come back to comfort me. They had come back because they believed tomorrow was the day they would finally get everything they wanted. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lucas smiling in the nursery, then heard his voice from the recording telling me not to trust anyone who insisted everything had to be signed immediately. By sunrise, I had made one decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to hide from my parents anymore. If they wanted another meeting, they were going to have one, just not the meeting they expected. Detective Mitchell coordinated everything before breakfast. Hospital administration agreed to let my parents into my room at their scheduled appointment, but security officers, federal investigators, Daniel, and 2 detectives would already be waiting nearby. No one wanted a dramatic confrontation. They wanted the truth to reveal itself naturally. Rebecca smiled gently as she adjusted my daughter's blanket. "You just focus on your little girl," she said. "We'll handle the rest." At exactly 9 o'clock there was a knock. My parents entered carrying the same leather folders I had come to hate. My father smiled warmly, almost convincingly. "Good morning, sweetheart. Feeling stronger today?" I nodded without smiling. My mother glanced toward the bassinet and quietly muttered, "The baby is sleeping again." She didn't even walk over to look at her granddaughter. Instead, my father immediately placed several documents on the movable hospital table. "These are the final authorizations. After today, everything will be much easier." I looked down without touching the papers. "Final authorizations for what?" He pointed confidently. "Insurance proceeds, federal survivor compensation, pension administration, temporary financial oversight." I deliberately asked the question I knew would matter. "Who becomes the temporary administrator?" He hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "Only until you're emotionally ready to handle everything yourself." "That's not what I asked." His smile faded. "Me." I nodded slowly. "So you would control the money?" "Protect it," he corrected. "There's a difference." My mother finally joined the conversation. "Megan, you have a premature baby, you've lost your husband, and you're barely sleeping. You're in no condition to make complicated financial decisions." I looked directly into her eyes. "Yet somehow I'm healthy enough to sign away authority." Neither of them answered. My father pushed a pen across the table. "Just sign here." I didn't move. "Before I do," I said quietly, "I'd like you to explain why applications were submitted while I was unconscious." His face remained surprisingly calm. "Because deadlines don't wait for grief." "And why was your consulting firm's email listed instead of mine?" "Administrative convenience." "Why was my electronic signature attached to forms I never saw?" This time he looked irritated. "Megan, enough. You're listening to people who are filling your head with suspicion." That was the moment Daniel stepped through the open doorway. "Actually," he said evenly, "she's listening to evidence." Behind him walked Detective Mitchell, 2 federal investigators, a hospital attorney, and 2 uniformed officers. My mother's face lost all color. My father slowly stood. "What exactly is the meaning of this?" Detective Mitchell placed her credentials on the table. "Mr. Harrison, we're investigating suspected fraud involving federal survivor compensation, identity misuse, and forged authorization documents." My father gave a short laugh. "Based on what?" She calmly opened a binder nearly 3 inches thick. your electronic submissions, cloud backups, financial correspondence, digital authentication records, and several emails you believed had been deleted. She placed the printed copies in front of him one by one. His expression remained controlled until she reached the message about using temporary guardianship to obtain financial authority. Then he stopped pretending to read. My mother suddenly stepped forward. "This is ridiculous. We were trying to help our daughter." Detective Mitchell turned another page. "Is this your email address?" My father looked at it without answering. "This message discusses using Officer Carter's survivor compensation to resolve Caleb Harrison's gambling debt." Silence. "Is this your email address?" she repeated. Finally he answered. "Yes." "Did you write these words?" Another long pause. "They've been taken out of context." At that moment another voice came from the doorway. "No, Dad." Everyone turned. Caleb stood there looking exhausted. He walked slowly into the room without looking at our parents. "They're exactly in context." My mother stared at him in disbelief. "Caleb!" He shook his head. "Don't." His eyes filled with tears. "I've lied for both of you long enough." He turned toward me. "She's telling the truth. Dad promised me he'd fix everything. He said Lucas's benefits would solve my debts before anyone noticed." My father exploded for the first time. "Be quiet." Caleb didn't stop. He forged the signatures because Megan wouldn't have agreed. He said she was too emotional to understand finances. My mother grabbed Caleb's arm. "You're confused." He gently pulled away. "No, Mom. I'm finally honest." Detective Mitchell quietly signaled one of the federal agents, who handed my father a formal notice. "Mr. Harrison, you're being advised that a federal investigation has been opened. We ask that you surrender all electronic devices used to prepare these filings." My father looked around the room searching for support. There was none. Nurses had gathered quietly outside the open door. Hospital staff, administrators, even visitors in the hallway had stopped to watch. The people my parents had expected to impress were now witnessing everything unravel. My mother suddenly pointed toward the bassinet. "This wouldn't have happened if Lucas hadn't left her with a baby to raise alone." The sentence echoed through the room. Before I could react, Evelyn stepped forward from the back of the crowd. She had arrived quietly a few minutes earlier and heard every word. She walked straight to the bassinet, gently lifted her granddaughter into her arms, and looked directly at my mother. "That little girl," she said calmly, "is the last gift my son gave this world. Don't ever call her a burden again." My mother looked away. Daniel then reached into his pocket. "There's one final thing." He placed his phone on the table and pressed play. Lucas's recorded voice filled the room once more. "Meg, if this message ever matters, remember something. Family isn't measured by blood. It's measured by who stays beside you when life falls apart." No one spoke until the recording ended. I slowly looked at my parents. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel afraid of disappointing them. "I'm done," I said quietly. "From this moment on, you are no longer part of my daughter's life. You are no longer part of mine." My father lowered his head without saying another word. Federal agents escorted him into the hallway. My mother stood frozen, looking from me to the baby and back again, as though she still expected me to change my mind. I didn't. The door closed behind them, and for the first time since Lucas died, the room finally felt peaceful. The weeks after that day were quieter than I expected. Not because everything was suddenly easy, but because the constant pressure that had followed me for years was finally gone. Once my parents were no longer calling, texting, or appearing at the hospital, I realized how much energy I had spent trying to keep peace with people who had never truly been at peace with me. Federal investigators interviewed me several times. Every meeting focused on facts instead of emotions. They walked through each electronic filing, every forged authorization, every redirected email, and every recovered message. My only job was to tell the truth. The evidence spoke for itself. Digital records confirmed that my signatures had been created while I was physically incapable of signing anything. Cloud backups preserved conversations my father believed had disappeared forever. Financial records connected the planned transfers to Caleb's mounting gambling debts. The investigation moved forward without drama because the paperwork was stronger than any explanation my parents could invent. Caleb cooperated completely. He admitted his debts, turned over his communications with our father, and entered treatment for his gambling addiction. We spoke only once during those first months. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply looked exhausted and said, "Lucas tried to protect you. I should have done the same." I told him that rebuilding trust would take time. For the first time in his life, he accepted an answer without arguing. My father lost his financial consulting license while the investigation continued. Several longtime clients left after learning what had happened. My mother spent months insisting that everything had been misunderstood, but fewer and fewer people believed her. They had spent years building a reputation based on responsibility and integrity. It disappeared far more quickly than it had been built. I didn't celebrate any of it. Watching your own parents face the consequences of their choices isn't satisfying. It's simply sad. The funeral for Lucas took place 2 weeks after I left the hospital. Officers from departments across Tennessee stood in silent rows as bagpipes echoed through the cemetery. I held my daughter close against my chest throughout the service. She slept peacefully through most of it, wrapped in the same knitted blanket Evelyn had brought to the hospital. When the honor guard folded the American flag and placed it in my hands, I finally understood that no amount of compensation, insurance, or government benefits could ever replace the man I had lost. They could provide security for our daughter. They could never replace her father. After the service, Daniel walked beside me toward the parking lot. "Lucas used to tell everyone you were stronger than you realized," he said. I smiled through tears. "He always overestimated me." Daniel shook his head. "No, he just saw you clearly before anyone else did." A month later, my daughter was finally healthy enough to leave the neonatal unit. Carrying her through the hospital doors felt like bringing light back into my life after weeks of darkness. Instead of returning to the house Lucas and I had shared, I accepted Evelyn's invitation to move into her small home just outside Nashville. At first I worried we might remind each other too much of what we had lost. The opposite happened. We reminded each other of what Lucas had loved. Mornings became simple. Evelyn made coffee while I fed the baby. Evenings were spent telling stories about Lucas that our daughter would someday hear for herself. Every photograph on the walls became part of her family history. She would grow up knowing the kindness, humor, and quiet courage of the father she never had the chance to remember. Daniel visited often. Sometimes he helped repair things around the house because Lucas had always been the one fixing everything. Other times he simply sat on the porch with Evelyn while I rocked the baby inside. No one treated us like charity cases. They treated us like family. Real family. Several months after moving in, I opened the small memory box Lucas had been putting together for our daughter before she was born. Inside were handwritten letters for future birthdays, a tiny police badge pin, photographs from our first vacation together, and a note addressed to me. It read, "If life ever forces you to start over, don't measure your future by what you lost. Measure it by the people still choosing to walk beside you." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. I understood those words differently now than I would have before. Blood had connected me to the people who betrayed me. Love connected me to the people who stayed. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether I ever spoke to my parents again. The answer is no. Not because I wanted revenge, but because peace requires boundaries. My daughter deserves to grow up surrounded by honesty instead of manipulation, kindness instead of control, and trust instead of fear. That is the inheritance Lucas truly left us. It wasn't money. It wasn't benefits. It wasn't the house or the pension. It was the example of a man who protected the people he loved until his very last day. My daughter is old enough now to ask about the photograph of the smiling police officer in our living room. I always tell her the same thing. That's your dad. He was brave, he was kind, and he loved you before he ever held you. Then she usually asks about Grandma Evelyn, Uncle Daniel, and the friends who still visit on birthdays. Watching her laugh with them reminds me of something I once learned in the hardest possible way. The people who share your last name are not always the people who become your family. Family is built by the hands that lift you when you cannot stand, the voices that tell the truth when lies would be easier, and the hearts that remain beside you after everyone else walks away. I lost my husband during the darkest week of my life. I also found the family that would help my daughter and me keep living, and, in the end, that became the greatest act of justice I could ever have hoped for.